So Revive the Future, we're really excited about this webinar series that we've just kicked off. The broad goal of this webinar series and why we've called it Revive the Future is essentially that we want to support new thinking and conversations and connections about post-fire recovery and how we manage for long-term resilience. And we chose a range of different topics related to that. And so we've asked for each of these webinars for a team of a scientist and practitioners or managers to work together to provide short presentations that highlight different dimensions of this. I also want to take a minute to call attention to the fact that we have asked our presenters, and we'd also like to ask you as participants, to use a trauma-informed approach in how we all engage today. What that means in plain language is we're taking care with the images, the words, and the tone that we use to maintain an environment that is considerate of the safety well-being of everyone here, anyone who may have experienced fire, smoke in some way. So you can do your part to help us maintain this environment by being respectful in your words, your tone when you're asking your questions, providing comments, and take care of yourself by stepping away or doing what you need to maintain your safety if you feel like you need to do that at any point. If you'd like to learn more about trauma-informed approaches, Oregon State University Extension actually has a really great trauma-informed toolkit, and Autumn's going to put a link to that in the chat. Now, oops, I'm sorry. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to introduce today's speakers. I'm really excited to have them here. Today's topic is community recovery, so that social organizational process of what happens in communities after they're affected by wildfire. Local governments and community groups are really on the front lines of figuring out what this looks like. So we've asked a social scientist and two long-term recovery group members to describe the social and organizational processes through which recovery happens and how communities can proactively plan for recovery. We're really grateful to have them here. We're going to be beginning with Dr. Heidi Huber-Stearns, who's a research associate professor and director of the Ecosystem Workforce Program at the University of Oregon. And then we're going to move on to John Moriarty, who is associate director of the McKenzie Long-Term Recovery Group. And then last, we'll hear from Kendall Melvin, who is program director with Glide Revitalization. That is enough for me. I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. Again, as a reminder, if you have questions, use the Q&A box. If you need help, use the chat box. Thank you so much. Heidi, you can take it away.
Thanks, EJ, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. So I'm just going to take a couple minutes to reflect on some work that we have been doing. I'm going to share my screen. And really looking forward to some discussion. And Autumn, let me know if you can't see my screen, but it should be up now for folks. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing in the Labor Day fire areas of the west side of Oregon, but then really spend our time with John and Kendall learning about what this looks like on the ground. I can't say this enough, I will just take a step back from the slide to say briefly, one of the absolute honors and privileges of the work that I do is getting to learn from and work with people like John and Kendall and others that are in community doing this work. And so what I'm sharing with you today is some research based on us looking at 3 long-term recovery study basins and some work that we'll be sharing out that you see here on the left, this fact sheet, around social and ecological challenges shaping wildfire response in the wake of the Labor Day fires. But more broadly, it's about really thinking carefully about how we center the communities of place and practice that are affected by this work. And so I'll reflect some of the learning that we've done through interviews and other work that we've done with people deeply in this space, but just wanting to recognize that this is us sharing what others have shared with their expertise and experiences and their lived experience in the space, and wanting to really honor and center that in our work. So to that end, I will be careful to not take up too much of our time. So just briefly, this is some research that we are conducting on these 3 fire basins, looking specifically at non-industrial private forest landowners and the recovery, both actually the broader response in these 3 fire sheds, these fire footprints, and then the recovery specifically for private forest landowner groups and the organizations that support them and others recovering. And so understanding what support's available and different ecological, social, and economic challenges for these lands. I'm not going to talk a lot about that specific subgroup today. I'm going to take a step back and reflect on some of the things that we are learning about and hearing in this space for wildfire recovery broadly in these the west side of Oregon in these landscapes. So one of the things that we are thinking carefully about is, again, this is an example of what this looks like, but thinking about what the recovery support networks look like at the watershed or the local level, and then more broadly at the state level. This is one of the things that we've been developing, thinking about how these different entities work together. Again, not just for private forest landowners, but how do we think about the roles of the critical roles of community-based organizations, nonprofits, other groups that are coming in either with philanthropy dollars, private funding, or others to help support some of this work, and trying to map out those connections to understand how we can think about this moving forward in the recovery space. So just an example of the complicated spaghetti bowl that is, as many of you have experienced yourselves. And so just a couple key reflections to get us started. And I know some of these things also John and Kendall will touch on in their work. You know, the core component here for the work that we are trying to undertake and understand is that trauma-informed care comes first. It's really about being responsive to the trauma first, and centering that, and the resources for recovery, the resources for rebuilding, the resources for relocation, whatever it is, often a lot of those need to come after that. And so kind of flipping the way that, particularly in academia, this often gets thought about, and centering the trauma-informed care and that immediate response in the work that we do is one of the key kind of core tenets that we've seen in the work that we've been doing. Another thing that we're seeing is just this, it's summed up fairly well by this particular quote, but this idea of the people that have time and money can look into getting support, and those that don't have those resources, or again, if you're trying to figure out how to get clothes on your back, you don't care about the trees on your property. So, you know, really reflecting this idea of thinking about the sequencing and process for what recovery looks like, and where people are at in that space. And so one of the things that we've heard from folks is that having some of these organizations available to provide resources is so helpful in that present, like the role of long-term recovery groups, like the two you'll hear from today, that kind of consistent presence is really critical, because not everyone needs the same support at the same time. And there's no clearly defined line between when, you know, you go from response to recovery, and that looks different for every household. So thinking carefully about what consistent lines of support can be in this space is one of the things that we've been learning a lot about from folks in these different fire footprints. A couple of the key challenges that we're hearing about, again, many of these are not surprising, but thinking about opportunities to work around, through, and elevate these are things such as some of the groups still having trouble accessing support in recovery are, again, individuals who are struggling to get their basic needs met, middle income families, the elderly, very rural households, and families with children that might not have the time or the capacity to engage in a lengthy application process for support. Again, the application process for different forms of support and the confusion and timeline for that, as well as the fronting of funding and uncertainty about reimbursement, whether that is for seedlings or other types of recovery resources. And another thing that we hear quite a bit about in some of these particularly rural places in these fire footprints is this hesitance to work with government groups or government funds to conduct some of the individual level recovery work that needs to take place, and just not being sure what that might look like for folks. And so keeping some of this in mind in how we shape recovery resources and access and communication are some of the areas that we've been exploring. And another quote from one of our interviewees that just talks a little bit about this, you know, they're so overwhelmed with the 15th set of paperwork, we're having them complete answering the same questions in a slightly different way for a new agency. This reinflicts trauma. They've given up. They can't move past the trauma because we're reinflicting it on them every time we get a new program with new funding. Again, this relates to a lot of these ideas about the process of recovery is not linear. It is really cyclical and iterative. It is going back, it's looping and messy, and ways in which the recovery system has been created that does reinflict trauma, thinking carefully about where we can be intentional about redesigning that is really critical to the individuals that are living this every day. I'm clicking faster than my screen is. So a couple key areas of learning that we're hearing about in the work that we're doing is prioritizing local organizations and those with pre-existing relationships to work directly with survivors. There are, in understanding where and how to plug in support, where it is needed and where it can be most helpful and thoughtful in engagement. That's one key area. Another is just having the systems in place ahead of time to get things like long-term recovery groups running. So how do we think about whole community long-term preparedness, not just response to events and standing up groups in response to that, which we'll hear from John and Kendall about the work that they're doing in this space. Long-term recovery, state the obvious, is much longer term than funders and policymakers realize. And again, it's not linear. And then thinking carefully about what other models or examples other states and communities have used in the recovery space and what from that might be relevant to what we see here in Oregon. That's another area we're digging into. So I'm just going to end with one other comment, which is another thing that we hear a lot, and I just think is worth elevating here, and hopefully we can hear this through John and Kendall as well. As part of these communities, there is no about community without community. So as a social scientist researcher in this space, thinking really carefully and thoughtfully about where and how we engage to help support and elevate the needs and work going on in the long-term recovery space in a way that is with community and not about community is one of the components that we are thinking pretty carefully about in our team. And it's always a learning process. So looking forward to learning from John and Kendall and others and a rich discussion today. So I'm going to stop my screen share and hand it over to John to take over. If you're ready, John.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Sound great.
Great.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. Yeah. And well, I have to say, I really appreciate a lot of what you just shared. It really foreshadows a lot of what I'm going to talk about from a very particular perspective in the McKenzie. And I'm going to do the same. I'm going to try to share my screen here. And just give me a second while I'm going to share a, let's see, get that right? Hold on just a sec. And I don't think I did what I wanted to do there. And you see the slideshow? You see a welcome slide?
Looks great.
Yes,
John.
it looks good.
Okay, thanks. So let me just clear a couple of things here on my side. So yeah, thanks everyone. And so I am John Moriarty, and I became the associate director at the McKenzie Valley Long-Term Recovery Group just in January. And prior to that, I was a senior program officer with the Oregon Community Foundation, serving the Southern Willamette Valley and the South Coast. And I mention that only because in that role, I also served on both OCF's COVID-19 and 2020 wildfire response team. So while my time with the LTRG is relatively short here in the McKenzie, I live in Eugene. I've worked in the McKenzie for quite some time, and I've had quite a bit of exposure and tangential engagement with this recovery since the fires. And I appreciate this opportunity to share a few thoughts, about this diverse community pathway to recovery. And my plan is to offer a little bit of that perspective about a lot of the things that Heidi talked about from one particular community's path. So I share this short sentence, recovery begins during response, as kind of a, I don't know, maybe a theme or a through line with a lot of what I'm going to talk about here today, because I think as Heidi mentioned, that recovery is not a linear thing. It's really cyclical and it cycles. And in fact, I think a lot of recovery begins very, very early. Just quickly wanted to give you an outline of what I want to talk about. I am going to take just a moment to set the stage to take a look back at that Labor Day in 2020, not too long. I appreciate the focus on trauma-informed approaches. but it's easy to forget, how challenging those first days were. And then I want to talk a little bit about the beginning of the long-term recovery group. And then I'd like to spend a few minutes on the challenges of connecting with and supporting survivors, as well as the importance that this has for equitable response. And then I'll wrap up with a quick plug about the importance of community-based organizations, or CBOs, in disaster response and recovery. So, as we recall, starting on September 7th, 2020, the McKenzie Valley and communities in 7 other counties across Western and Southern Oregon experienced some of the most widespread and devastating wildfires in our history. And here in the McKenzie, the Holiday Farm Fire burned more than 173,000 acres, upwards of 500 dwellings, and took a life before it was contained about a month later. And that initial state and local response to the fires were pretty limited. Well, of course, with the exception of first responders, the very important exception there, but by and large, the state and local response was pretty muted. There wasn't a lot of preparedness, I think, there, and the informal response was pretty chaotic and unorganized too. This is a shot from Springfield High School. I spent several days at Springfield High School as a volunteer in the early days after the fire, and it was an ad hoc relief center. It had already evacuated once from Thurston High School further east, and it was really, really critical for folks coming out of the fire. And it was staffed by neighbors from the McKenzie Valley, sometimes fire survivors themselves. Individuals and nonprofits from surrounding communities provided some of the most active response for crucial days and in some cases weeks after the fire started, and they stayed engaged. And I know this was true across all of those areas where the fires hit. So the very initial response from funding was largely from private donations and a little bit of philanthropic support in those early days. And I included this graph, which is hand-drawn, so apologies, but I think it does a pretty good job of illustrating something that is seen over and over post-disaster, and that is that there's typically a very large private donor response in the first few weeks following a major disaster, and then that funding, as you can see, drops off precipitously. And I think this does a good job of illustrating what actually happens, usually around week 6 or so. And the philanthropic sector was trying to figure out when would be the best time to really lean in with the funding that we were developing, and where that would fit in the need. And with a few exceptions, they settled for the most part on that medium term, between 6 months to about 2 years post-fire. And I think that ended up being a fairly good decision in terms of when a lot of those resources were necessary. So in terms of the McKenzie Valley Long-Term Recovery Group and others, I'll start by saying that those flexible philanthropic dollars, those early dollars, were really critical to the formation of our recovery group, our LTRG, as well as other LTRGs and community organizations responding to the fires across the state. The LTRG in the McKenzie was formed as an all-volunteer organization in May of 2021. And so that actually happened at the request of, in many cases, foundations and local and state agencies who were looking for a way to connect. And I'll note very briefly that this LTRG, or Long-Term Recovery Group model, is part of the FEMA response model. It's not something that was established here in Oregon. It's been a part of that model for decades. And so we are that local sort of manifestation here of that model. What I don't have on this slide, so we see that in May of 2021, the LTRG is formed. But what's not included here is that another organization, McKenzie Locals Helping Locals, actually formed while the fire was still burning. And these are survivors in the valley who began supporting each other. At first, it was really informal, and then they began to work with a fiscal sponsor to facilitate donations. Eventually, it became its own 501c3, and then now, several years later, it's actually let go of that 501c3 and become a program of the LTRG. But the LTRG couldn't have been successful without members of Locals Helping Locals bridging the gap between fire survivors and then helping our earned trust that we had with locals helping locals really be transferred to the broader community, because this recovery work is so relationship based, and without that trust building on the part of some key folks in the Valley, it would have been very difficult for us to be successful and to really form. So it's so important to point that out. And then the McKenzie LTRG hired our first executive director in September of 2021, and I'm very grateful that he's still here and working with us. And I'll also note that within months after the fire itself, federal funds had been allocated to hire disaster case managers, or DCMs, who came to the McKenzie Valley from throughout Oregon and the country. And really in retrospect, and even at the time, though I was not directly involved with the LTRG, I'd have to say that those initial DCM efforts were they seemed kind of perfunctory. They spent very little time actually on the ground, in the field, in community, and much of their work was really being done from offices. And what we discovered, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, and Heidi mentioned this a little bit, is that people with capacity already took advantage of that open door. Certainly an open door was created, but some folks were able to take advantage of that and register. But an unknown number of survivors simply, they didn't know about these opportunities, or they didn't have the wherewithal to really respond to the invitation to be a part of that. And that really didn't change until the spring of 2022, when the LTRG finally received funding to hire truly local disaster case managers in the McKenzie Valley. And Locals Helping Locals, quite honestly, provided some important qualified candidates for that too. So there were some unique challenges in 2020. As you all know, the wildfires occurred while we were simultaneously coping with COVID-19. And that impacted just about everything from congregate shelter to the cost of materials, the availability of materials, you name it, it was impacted by COVID. I think we all recognize that our very limited experience with massive disaster events in Oregon up until that time meant that county and state agencies and nonprofits, all of whom were already stretched thin by COVID, really struggled with response and coordination and communication. That was across the board. The wildfire, as it did in so many places, crippled local businesses and infrastructure across the McKenzie Valley. And then the McKenzie Valley is rural, it's unincorporated, and it's economically disadvantaged, but with a wide range of incomes due to second home ownership in the valley. So there was some built-in economic inequity in the area, even pre-fire. That's a part of the reality when we're working on recovery. Internet and cell phone connectivity is limited and inconsistent, still is to a certain degree. It certainly was after the fire. And there's a significant low-income, elderly, and mobility-limited population in the valley as well. So it took over a year to get this number of 517 dwellings lost from the county settled on that number. It took over a year to get that reasonably accurate tally of dwellings lost during the Holiday Farm fire. And it took even longer to really gain clarity about the number of families who are unaccounted for, or were at the time unaccounted for, on official lists. And this is really critical. It was well over a year after the fire before our team of local DCMs could determine what families from the fire scar were still unaccounted for. And that's a required step in terms of disaster relief and recovery eligibility. I want to talk a little bit about the distinction between equal availability and equitable access. After the disaster, a number of federal, state, and local response programs are typically established, and that was certainly true in Oregon. Once those are established, those federal, state, and county agencies advertise those programs, they conduct outreach, they place those disaster case managers, and all of this is designed to create an open door, equal availability to all. There's no intention in this of discrimination in this process of any sort. And a subset of survivors, often those with the most capacity, have that capacity to walk through the door that's open to them, and they register and they qualify as they should, and they begin receiving funding and services. So those limited resources begin to be expended most quickly, as it turns out, oftentimes on those with the most capacity to access them. There's another subset of survivors, often those who've experienced historic marginalization of one sort or another, that don't successfully walk through that open door. And they don't register, they don't begin to have access to those resources. And so that's really, that's where the inequitable aspect of that access starts to come into play. So we've got equally accessible, equally available, but inequitable access. And I want to note, of course, that marginalized and underserved groups are going to be different in every community. At the intersection of race, rural zip code, sexual orientation, economic status, so many different things, that marginalization can increase and increase that inequitable set of factors that people are facing. So from the practitioner perspective, what we learned in the McKenzie Valley is that local community-based engagement is really critical to bringing equity to the response and recovery process. Residents in rural communities, they know one another. They know who's missing from the official lists. And well, once they have access to the official lists and can see, they can recognize, who's not there. And they know the challenges inherent in living rurally. Once the LTRG, the McKenzie Valley LTRG, was finally able to obtain resources and hire trusted community members as DCMs, we were able to start reaching out to the most vulnerable populations. We were able to identify 113 households that were not included in any way. This is well over a year after the fire in the disaster case management system. So if we're talking about just over 500 houses, that's over 20% of folks who were not in the system. And until we knew that and we knew who they were, we really couldn't begin to look for them. And of course, by that time, as we've mentioned, a number of those programs and early resources were already being deployed. So we had 113 families that hadn't been included in that process at all. Yeah. The importance of individualized support in this situation, and this goes back to trauma-informed care, can't be overemphasized. Once our team knew which 113 families whose homes had been destroyed were missing from the case management roles, they set out to find those people. And they found them in motels. They found them living in RVs on their own property, staying with friends, with relatives, couch surfing. And as expected, many were elderly. Several were living with disabilities or caring for children with disabilities. All of them were deeply, deeply traumatized by the fire and the magnitude of their loss. And the first thing our team did was listen. They listened, they listened like a neighbor, like a friend, with a lot of empathy and a lot of concern, genuinely. Many of them had experienced loss of their own, our DCMs. And then oftentimes after all that listening, they just listened more. They just had to keep listening. That was the first step. And that takes time. That's not a slow process, and it needs to take time. And then they gently begin to explain the process of needing to be registered in the system. And they're often explaining that to folks who are not deeply trustful of government programs to begin with. So that's also something that takes some time and takes some trust. So with little to no internet access and very limited self-service in the Valley, they often began to assist with hard copies of paperwork to get that process moving. They worked with survivors to track down or replace identification, insurance policy information, homeownership documentation, all sorts of critical paperwork that was lost in the fire. They provided their cell number to call if they needed more help. And critically, if they didn't hear from folks after a week or so, they visited again. They went back. It wasn't just a check next to the name and we can move on. So as I mentioned, within the Holiday Farm fire footprint in the McKenzie, it turned out that our equity issues revolved primarily around age, disability, and socioeconomic status. And of course, that can be very different in other communities. So there are a million factors that could contribute to the lack of access, equitable access to resources. And I've just listed a few that we encountered in the McKenzie. Everything from not being contacted at all, or being too traumatized to understand programs, to not having access to documents that were destroyed in the fire, you name it. And there will be different factors impacting people in different communities all the time. But I think the key to successful disaster case management is not only in the forms that need to be completed or the checklist of contacts that have to be made, it's also about identifying these kinds of factors. Excuse me. It's coming off of COVID myself, speaking of our old friend COVID. But it's also about identifying those factors that prevent people from engaging in the system and then working to address them. So we have to identify what the challenges are, and then we have to take the time to work to address those challenges for individuals. So sort of turning now toward the future, one message I'd like to share today and leave you with is that local people are absolutely crucial to recovery. And community-based organizations, CBOs, are often a great place where local folks can most effectively engage. There has to be some organization to that process. That's what emerged in the McKenzie with Locals Helping Locals, and it happens other places as well. And as I mentioned at the outset, recovery really begins during the response. And in fact, I would even take that, a step further and say that a lot of this recovery work begins before an event occurs. And we really begin to look around and dig into the fact that we need to build these local CBOs into the disaster recovery response model before we need them, before that model has to be implemented. And then we have to, recognize that our understanding of disaster is changing with climate disruption. And you all, I think, in the consortium know this better than I do. What was once a long-term return rate is now far more frequent, especially when we include locally devastating events that maybe don't rise to the level of federally declared disasters. So we need to work in these blue sky times to support communities in identifying the resources, the people, the infrastructure, the funding sources that can form the basis of their resilience building and their response network before they need it and before we need it. And we need to do this with respect for the local knowledge and the uniqueness of each community. So however we define community, whether it's geographic or demographic or both, the local partners in resiliency and response and recovery really have to lead the way. And they need to reflect the lived experience of the community that they serve. So the last thing I'll share is that though our recovery work in the McKenzie Valley isn't complete yet, the LTRG is continuing to explore our role and responsibility in this next phase of preparation beyond the Valley. We're asking questions and engaging community throughout the state to help us understand the role we can play in sharing our experience, not as a model. It's different everywhere, but being able to share our experience and some of the hard knocks and help those other communities build more resilient future. So thank you for that, and I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen as soon as I can figure that out. I'll end the slideshow.
Great, thank you,
back up.
John. And as John is doing that, we're going to turn it over to Kendall to share some reflections. Thanks, Kendall, for joining us. And Kendall, you don't have slides, so we'll just be focused on your face, which is great. Take it away.
All right, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Perfect. Well, I'm Kendall Melvin. I'm the program director for Glide Revitalization, and I also chair on the long-term recovery group since 2021. I came on with Glide Revitalization after the fire. I actually started as a case manager, and so my experience was getting straight in, boots on the ground, going and figuring out who was on my case list and making connections and relationships right off the bat. As I started to do that, I got the opportunity in so many spaces with our organization to voice better practices and good ways that we could move forward to assist these folks and kind of climbed through the ranks here. One thing that is extremely unique about Glide Revitalization is that we are also the long-term recovery group. So the same staff that are running the nonprofit are the long-term recovery group. We each hold a responsibility within that. One staff member is responsible for the spiritual and emotional care. Another is responsible for, linking monetary resources. Another for a different part of the LTRG, so on and so forth. Why that is so special to us is that it takes out all of the middleman. It takes out the requests for funding. Say a survivor comes up to you and they need a washer and dryer. Rather than having to write a request form and take it to another, sometimes 501c3 LTRG with their own approval committee, we have our own in-house approval and denial process that we would go to. And usually same day, if not next day, know whether we're going to be able to cut a check for the survivor or not. It's worked out wonderfully for us. And because of the rural nature of Glide being unincorporated and leery when it comes to government assistance, having that same face for this survivor is so valuable. Oh my gosh, having them come in and, okay, you go talk to Steve and he's going to be able to tell you whether you're going to get funding today. He can go right to your house because he's your neighbor. He knows where it's at. They have that level of trust right off the bat. They're not having to talk to different representatives or have that trauma response of having to re-explain again and again. It's the same person. Glide's impact from the Archie Creek fire, I think it was 109 homes that ultimately were lost. Some of our area is unique in that it's on a scenic byway. So there was struggles with trying to find out if people could even rebuild. And then once they did decide whether they were going to, jumping through state processes of, your deck can only be so big because you can see it from the road and so on and so forth. So there's different challenges with every single area. And I think that long-term recovery looks different to organizations too. So echoing a lot of what John said, I mean, we really do fit right in that same situation as McKenzie, where we, have that rural feel, unincorporated. The funding comes to us as a nonprofit rather than a city government. The differences with us, though, are being all in one house. We did also get the RFA contract in June of 2021 to house our own DCM. So we were fortunate in that we didn't actually have contracted DCMs from any other area. It was always the staff within Glide Revitalization that did the casework right at the beginning. We started identifying a whole bunch of needs for our community during recovery that actually weren't necessarily fire impact. As we're going out and we're talking to families and we're like, okay, let's look at building you a house. We start noticing that, well, we can build you a house, but you haven't been able to get back to work yet. And you're not going to be able to get back to work yet if you don't have childcare. And so we started identifying these big community needs that were actually overshadowing a lot of the fire recovery itself. That shifted our focus completely. I mean, we started obviously on the fire impact, but at this point in time, Glide Revitalization is actually focused on community recovery as a whole. If we don't have long-term funding and economics to keep our town thriving, why is anyone going to want to recover here in the first place? So we started meeting those gaps. In January, we opened a childcare center called Little Loggers Play School that has Archie Fire Impact Family Priority enrollment. We can have up to 20 kiddos in there, and it's discounted tuition. We actually charge lower than the state rate. So we started to meet that need, and now we're currently moving towards actually opening a resource center where rather than having to commute 25 minutes to go meet with OHP or WIC or go to a doctor's appointment, we are going to have a monthly revolving calendar of these services that actually come out to our area and meet people right where they're at. OHCS is willing to have a representative there, and ODHS, so we can continue some of these partnerships that are so valuable to us in fire recovery, but also translate them into overall community recovery. We've taken on reforestation and mitigation as part of the long-term recovery. We are replanting seedlings on private land. I think we've done about 400,000 so far, and that's actually been in partnership with OSU. Most people that live rural like us and McKenzie Valley, that's what they're concerned about. They live out here for a reason. It's the beauty and the silence, and those trees mean absolutely everything to them. I've heard people have more of a trauma response in some cases to the acreage that burned on their land rather than the structures themselves, because they used to sit out there and drink their coffee. That was really, really important for us. So we've done a lot in that realm. And then keeping the brush back now that the big timber's gone. We're really focused on mitigation and getting crews out there and keeping the slick leaf cut and blackberries away so that they can still manage that land now. I think some important next steps and just some questions I kind of wanted to present to the group as brainstorming, think on it yourself, is how we can better suit funding for these groups that are down here doing the work. John hit the nail on the head when he showed that graph of, all the funding's right there at the start and then it's gone. And I think that there's better ways to do it. I think focusing on those local nonprofits and those local long-term recoveries that know the neighbors and pouring the resources into them with oversight would be so impactful, letting them do the work, and just, kind of stepping back and funding those programs at year 3. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kendall, John, and Heidi. It was really wonderful to hear from each of you about, Heidi, your research, and John and Kendall, your experiences. I appreciate the time you took to share this. We have a few minutes left for question and answer. And so if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box and we will answer them. I'll give it a minute to see who does. I have some questions if no one asks. I'll go ahead with a question and give others time. I actually would love to hear from all of you on this. How can social science researchers like Heidi and her colleagues kind of most effectively enter into that complicated space after a fire? How can they most respectfully bring attention to what the needs and experiences are, but not also just be part of that trauma and a lot of outsiders? What are some of the things you've learned from working with Heidi and others?
You want me to take a swing at that first? I'll just do it real quickly. Well, I think you make a good point about, I think timing is important. I think you can only go in so early. There's so many questions. There's so much stuff. And I think I love the trauma-informed focus that you brought to this webinar, the work you're doing. And that's part of it, is that people just need time. And I think what we need to do is keep learning. We don't have to do all our learning right after the event that just happened. We have a lot of material to learn from now, and that's the work you're doing now. So I appreciate that. And then the second thing I think that's important is figuring out how to share that beyond academia and making it available and helping turn it into policy, because most of us doing this work, we're working with some of the biggest agencies, FEMA and state agencies, and contracts that are 45 pages long, and we don't have a lot of time left for the policy side of this. And so much of it revolves around how well, and Kendall, I so appreciated you bringing up the point that what we're saying is help get these dollars to the ground locally. And that doesn't solve everything. There's local stuff, there's work to be done, in our own communities in how we do things. There's no question about that. But a lot of this is relationship and recognizing the value so early on. And I was so glad to hear that those DCMs, I remember that Glide Revitalization had those on staff in the community right away. And that was a huge step forward. So that's a learning opportunity. And how do we build that into the model and have local communities ready to take that on? Because of Glide Revitalization already existing, that's part of that blue sky work. They were there and had the capacity to accept those staff. So we have a lot to do in between. And I think you all can help us do that work in between.
Kendall, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, or Heidi, from your experience.
Yeah, I'd be happy to add. One function of LTRGs is called an unmet needs roundtable, where needs are presented to CBOs in a Zoom, typically, sometimes hybrid in person, but where individual needs from the survivors are brought forward and discussed right there with no names involved, but with situation-based requests. And having people like you on those unmet needs tables, not just the local CBOs, I think would be really beneficial, because number one, it's going to show just exactly what's needed in the community. And number two, it'll be very educational for your agency to be able to go back and see what this might look like in the future.
That's great. We do have a few questions in the chat. So one from Quinn. Are there recommendations to help capture monetary or physical donations in the early days of the disaster before a long-term recovery group is formed? And then what can be done to help highlight the ongoing community's recovery needs in the long term, which I think you were just addressing, Kendall. So how to address those early days when a lot of donations are coming in.
I think that's part of the answer to that is that blue sky preparation. A lot of these small communities don't have a lot of that organization done. It's not that the capacity isn't there and the assets aren't there and the people aren't there to do that, but we have to be thinking about that when it's not trauma time. And that was, I can tell you, one of the things that we would love to have people learn from observing our experience is how hard it was to establish that LTRG and the infrastructure that went with it to be a nonprofit right in the aftermath of the fire, when everybody was literally in that mode of survival. And so if we can be thinking about, Glide and Glide Revitalization are a great example of an organization that existed and had the capacity to begin receiving those funds from a legal standpoint. And then as that LTRG is forming, it could very well form through that organization. They're historically in that FEMA model, I think they're thought of as all volunteer all the time. And that, I'm afraid that part of the model has outlived its reality, given the size and the magnitude and the frequency of disasters now. So just not having to reinvent that every time. And I know on our end, we've talked about the possibility of, we did all this work in the McKenzie to create this LTRG, rather than having it slip away. How do we transfer that? Is there a way for us to be able to sort of shrink in the McKenzie when the work is done, but have the infrastructure live on so that it can emerge kind of like mycelia and a mushroom, fruiting in another community when it's needed, and not have to do all of that background work? I have spoken with policymakers about how we don't lose the incredible investment of time, resources, and energy that went into creating this organization so that it could be successful and not have to do that all over again in Oak Ridge, when one of these fires, comes in there, or in Lowell, or wherever that might be, or on the coast. So I think we need to think about how we we're still the long-term recovery group, but what we've learned is that our mission, and we're being intentional now as an organization, our board and staff are looking at how that mission is evolving, whether we want it to or not. And we do want it to, but it's happening because people are contacting us for support. How can we be intentional about actually stepping into that next role, which is looking for ways to make this work more effectively the next time around? So that's, I think, again, it's this blue sky opportunity to do some of this work so that when that time comes, we're ready for it.
It seems like it speaks a lot to the delicate balance, and this gets at a question we have from Amanda in the chat. How do we collaborate to get these lessons learned and recommendations out to larger audiences like policymakers? And maybe finding that balance between, here are some of the things we learned, but there's no single template, there's no single recipe. It's very dependent on your local context. So some balance there in sharing those lessons. Kendall, I don't know if you want to add anything to what John was saying.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback off of him mentioning during Blue Sky Days. A lot of the model currently, from what we're seeing, is that LTRGs fade into the background as the disaster recovery ends. But what that also means is LTRGs are no longer funded. And so having blue sky funding for these people who have the experience and the knowledge to keep them involved, keep them driving trainings locally or even not local. We have all these big disasters that are happening on the East Coast right now. There's wealth of knowledge from people that have walked through some different disasters that could help other long-term recovery groups get established quicker with their knowledge. Blue sky funding is a place to start to keep the players at play.
I just wanted to reinforce that. I think it's a really great point. Not only were locals helping locals critical from the relationship partnership side, but Carleen Anders is a name many people on this call might recognize. She did a tremendous amount of work up in the Okanagan, developing an LTRG up there, and has become a resource for so many people across Oregon and other places. It's that experience. Not that she any of us would come in and say, this is how you do it. It's this opportunity to first listen. Listening is so critical to what the community you're visiting, if you're somewhere else, needs. And then offering, examples of what happened with us. And so it's not about sharing a model that's very specific, but it's saying, here are some experiences that we had, and we'd love to, if they can be helpful for you, please take what you can and adapt it as you need to.
Great. We're coming to the end of the webinar. We have one more question, which is from Amy. Is there a list for Washington and Oregon of all the current long-term recovery groups and organizations like yours? Heidi, do you know? I don't believe there
I would
is.
ask Kendall or John. I don't know. I mean, we have some of our own lists, but they're not complete.
Yeah, Oregon VOAD keeps a running list of most of them, but you have to be involved in the VOAD to have your information shared on their website and such. So I don't know if you know of any other resources, John, but Oregon VOAD is where I know to find others.
I think that's a great starting point, and I'm sure there's something similar in Washington. And then there are some informal, areas. Some of the organizations that have been really instrumental in helping since the start. There's a consulting group, Kelly Nonprofit Consulting, did a lot of work with a lot of organizations. They have lots of contact information and are very generous in sharing and that sort of thing as well.
Great. Thank you for addressing that. I just would like to, again, thank you, Heidi, John, Kendall, for the perspectives you've shared and what you've offered. Autumn is going to put a link again in the chat, everyone, to please just take a second to take our 1-minute survey. And please also sign up if you haven't for these future webinars. And then as one last reminder, you will be receiving a email with the link to this recording once it's done.